Murder and Such contains stories about murders, the macabre, true crime, serial killers, and other dark subject matter. This includes adult themes, language, descriptions of gore, violence, and other information provided by news articles, witness testimony, and public record. Murder and Such is not intended for all audiences, and although warnings will be set in place, listener discretion is still advised.
The first thing I would like to do is thank each and every one of you who took the time out of your day to share your thoughts about part 1 of this series. I was pretty worried about the reaction that I would get for going solo, but your guys' feedback has helped give me a little bit more hope doing the show. It's no secret that I was struggling with the direction of which to take Murder and Such, but I think we're gonna be okay. Also, to those of you who messaged me saying that you called someone, I personally want to thank you for doing that. If there was any silver lining to the attack in Dayton, it's that no matter how hard things get, our friends and loved ones are the ones who make our community strong, and we can come together with unmatched power and compassion to shine a light even on the darkest of days. So as always, thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing the show with a friend, and also, thank you for being here with me. So picking up where we last left off, Dustin Honken was facing a decade or more in prison after one of his 2 dealers, Greg Nicholson, cooperated with the police, which led to the investigators to charge Dustin with the manufacturing and distribution of methamphetamine. Not only that, but it was a federal charge as opposed to a charge being handed down by the state of Iowa. When he was first arraigned in court, he said that he planned to plead guilty to the federal drug crimes. That is, until he and his girlfriend, Angela Johnson, had devised a plan to make sure that Dustin would get off scot-free. Dustin's court date was set for July 30th of 1993. However, the plan between he and Angela was to eliminate Greg before he had the chance to testify against him. So Angela and Dustin started scouring the area looking for Greg, and even purchased a Tech 9 handgun from a pawn shop 80 miles away, since it would be a lot easier to track Angela down had it been purchased locally. Then finally, on the night of July 24th of 1993, Angela and Dustin tracked down Greg to his girlfriend Lori Duncan's house, in which he lived with her and her 2 daughters, 10-year-old Candace and 6-year-old Amber. While there, Dustin coerced a false statement from Greg and recorded it with a camcorder, then proceeded to beat, torture, then strangle Greg, Lori, and her 2 daughters to death. When they were finished, they loaded up the bodies into Angela's car, drove southwest of Mason city limits, shot the bodies, then left them in a shallow grave before returning home at 5 a.m. the following morning. On the 26th of July is when all 4 were reported missing. All 4 had vanished into thin air with no trace to be found. The key witness and police informant was missing along with his girlfriend and her 2 daughters, and they could not be found anywhere, and it wouldn't be for many years to come until they finally found the family southwest of town in a shallow grave. So as always, I thank you for being here with me today. My name is Hunter, and you're listening to Murder and Such, and this is part 2 of the case of Dustin Lee Honken.
The Justice Department says it plans to execute federal inmates for the first time since 2003. The department says 5 inmates will be executed starting in December.
Attorney General William Barr said the Justice Department upholds the rule of law. We owe it to the victims and their families to carry forward the sentence imposed by our justice system.
One of those 5 inmates will be a man convicted of brutal murders right here in Iowa. Dustin Honken, a drug kingpin from Mason City who killed witnesses and children back in 1993, is scheduled to be executed. Honken was convicted at a trial in 2004 of 5 counts of murder.
He was in the northern district of Iowa running a drug distribution operation. The feds caught up to him, they were prosecuting him. He was about to plead guilty, but he was still trying to get out of it by eliminating the witnesses against him.
When he laid his daughter and 2 granddaughters to rest in Mason City this month, David Milbrath closed a sad chapter in his family's life. The remains of Lori Duncan and her 2 young daughters, Candy and Amber, were found buried in a field next to the remains of 2 men.
There was a long period of time that we waited, knowing that something had happened and not knowing where the girls were at. Sure, they were, lost.
Tortured and executed, the Duncans have been called the victims of circumstance after Lori allowed one of those men to move in with them after he ratted out Dustin Honken, a convicted drug kingpin, to the authorities.
And an Iowa man who killed 5 people 26 years ago will be one of the first to be executed.
These people took lives, innocent lives. I don't feel that they should live any longer than necessary. Once they're found guilty, they should be eliminated as soon as possible.
So from that intro, you heard them discuss the murders of 5 people. Trust me, we will touch base on that, and all of your questions will be answered in due time. But if you've listened to the show, you know that I prefer to lay out all the parts of the story in chronological order. According to the information obtained by the 8th Circuit Court of Iowa, during an appeal, it said that Dustin had gone to his hearing 5 days later that he was scheduled for, and decided not to plead guilty to the charges, obviously because Greg Nicholson couldn't show up to the hearing since he was murdered 5 days prior and buried in a grave on the outskirts of the city limits. When he was there, he talked to his attorney and told him that he believed that Greg had skipped town with his girlfriend with her 2 kids to avoid some, quote, other stuff that he believed he could be arrested for. The other thing that I would like to bring up is attorney-client privilege. When you have a legal representative, there's a statute where you can tell your attorney practically anything related to your case, and your attorney can help you craft your defense to either omit your claims or completely bury them. While Dustin was meeting with his attorney, he had given him the VHS tape of the confession he recorded of Greg that would completely exonerate him of any wrongdoing. He gave his lawyer a story about how he came home one day and found the VHS tape on his doorstep. I mean, come on, that makes 0 sense and is a very piss-poor job of lying. Even to your attorney, which, granted, you're trying to look at any and all outlets to get your client off the hook for whatever crime they have committed, but still, as an attorney, I would still look at him and think to myself, are you fucking serious? He went back to the idea that Greg had skipped town, so there was no way of verifying this evidence to a court, or showing that it was taken on his own volition and free will. So when everything was said and done, the judge had postponed the hearing after Dustin had pled not guilty to the charges at hand. They had no key witness and no one to corroborate the case against Dustin, and the prosecution had to work with what evidence they had to try and nail Dustin to the boards for the federal drug charges. He wasn't being held in jail, however, and he was still free to go as he pleased. But something was definitely different with him. A few days later, the feds were informed that Greg wasn't around, and he had not contacted them to say where he was going, so they kept the investigation going, considering these were massive charges in a crime that was starting to plague the residents of Mason City. The meth was just getting started and more people kept getting arrested for the possession of said drug. Common side effects of methamphetamine usage are erratic sleep patterns or hyperinsomnia, hyperactivity, or unusually high energy, the display of twitches or what's referred to as tics, also a loss of motor functions and muscle memory, extreme loss of appetite, and one more thing, obsessive focus on a particular issue or task. That's something that I think Dustin might have got himself into. I can't say for sure whether or not Dustin was using meth at the time, but he started getting a little bit more obsessed with something. Now, I am no expert on the human psyche, but I can tell you that when you've murdered a man who is set to put you behind bars, his girlfriend, and her 2 daughters, you might start getting a little paranoid or obsessive. Now, personally, I've done some shitty things in my past. Granted, none have been murder or anything like that, but we've all had those moments where we've done something bad, felt remorse, guilt, or some sort of empathy for what we may have done. I think it's pretty much basic human nature. Mostly everyone knows right from wrong, and I'm not here to judge you or your actions, just Dustin and Angela for theirs. It was around early July of 1993 that Angela had found out that she was pregnant with Dustin's child. So Dustin and Angela kept continuing to live their life. It's even been said in the Globe-Gazette that since Dustin had pled not guilty, so he started working again on acquiring all of the chemicals and stuff needed to continue his meth manufacturing process, which is pretty fucking stupid to keep that going while you're currently staring down the barrel of some federal charges. But as I said before, Dustin had a very small group of people that he dealt with, and he already eliminated one. But then he started obsessing over the other dealer, Terry DeGuess. Dustin didn't trust Terry, considering that Greg had flipped on him, and Dustin had found himself some different people to help wheel and deal his product to the Mason City masses. Meanwhile, the feds are still trying to build a case against him and investigate what happened to the 4 missing people. I'm no criminal mastermind whatsoever, but one would think that since you're facing some severe charges, in which you murdered the key witness against you and you have to imagine the cops aren't going to go, well, I guess this is it, might as well pack it up and let him go. Now, that's not how an investigation works. That's not how any of this works. As time went on, Dustin started becoming fixated on the idea that Terry DeGuess could flip on him, as it was so easy for Greg to do the same. He started talking to Angela about it, and she agreed with him. He even stated to Timothy Cutcomp how he thought that Terry was going to testify against him, and how he believed that since the investigation was ongoing, he thought that Terry had been subpoenaed to testify in front of a grand jury in place of Greg Nicholson. This is starting to border on paranoia. Going back to part 1 of the story, I mentioned how Terry DeGuess and Angela Johnson were boyfriend and girlfriend. Now, we've all been there before. Maybe there's a certain someone in your past who holds a deep spot in your heart, and maybe you'd be willing to give them another chance. Honestly, the heart and emotions are both crazy things, and, sometimes you can get yourself into some trouble over it. I'm no relationship advisor, trust me. But I will say that I have been there before, and I've maybe let some people back into my life that, maybe I shouldn't have. Well, considering that Terry was up to date on what was happening with Dustin's case, Angela had decided to concoct a plan. Angela started speaking with Terry and telling him that she was afraid of Dustin, and that they got into a massive fight over the pending drug charges against him, not to mention how she felt like she couldn't go anywhere or get help with anything considering she was pregnant with his child at this time. So taking into account the fact that Terry might have felt jaded but he and Angela had broken up for her to date Dustin, he swooped back in to hopefully rekindle the relationship that he had with Angela. Little did he know that this would be a mistake that would soon cost him his life. After a few phone call discussions about how Angela could get away from Dustin, they had decided to meet up on November 5th of 1993. Earlier in the day, Terry had talked to his mother and asked her if she could watch his 10-year-old daughter. Now, I couldn't find a name of his mother or daughter, but that's not really pertinent to the story. So after she agreed, Terry headed out to her house earlier in the evening. When he was there, he left his daughter and told his mother that Angela was in trouble and he was going to meet up with her and try to figure out a plan to get her away from Dustin. He told her that he wouldn't be long and he would be back shortly to pick up his child, then take her home with him. That, unfortunately, would never happen. That night, after dropping off his daughter, Angela and he had planned to meet up southwest of Mason City. So Terry headed out that way and finally caught up with Angela. When he was out there, Angela told him that she knew that Dustin was dangerous and that he was looking for Terry. Obviously, trying to console his former girlfriend, Terry had explained to her that he wasn't in contact with the police and wasn't about to rat out Dustin or turn informant to the police department. After a little while, Terry had heard some approaching footsteps. Now we all know who that was. Dustin. Dustin had with him a baseball bat. He started questioning Terry about whether or not the police were talking to him, in which Terry was probably begging for his life at this time. After not feeling satisfied with Terry's responses, Dustin started to beat Terry with a baseball bat. Dustin had only one thing on his mind. Considering that Terry and Greg were both the two people of interest in Dustin's case, he knew that he would be completely let go of any pending investigations if he took out Terry. Not even 4 months earlier, Dustin and Angela had eliminated a family of 3 plus Greg and buried their bodies. Dustin had no qualms about eliminating one more person. After beating the shit out of Terry, Dustin and Angela debated on what to do. Could he keep quiet? Could he be trusted? Obviously not, so Dustin went to the car and grabbed the same Tech-9 that he used back in July and put the barrel to Terry's head and shot him twice. Angela then went and grabbed 2 shovels out of the trunk of the car and they proceeded to dig yet another shallow grave, throw Terry's body in it, and left him to rot just 10 miles away from Mason City on the outskirts of the town named Birchinall. Then Angela got into their car and Dustin got into Terry's car and abandoned it at an apartment complex back in Mason City. That night, Terry's mother and daughter anxiously awaited for Terry to return, in which he never did. The next day, after failing to hear from him, Terry's mother had decided to call in to the authorities and report that Terry was missing and left his daughter at her place. When they reported him missing, they had told the police that he was to meet up with Angela Johnson, but when Angela had talked to the police later on, she had stated that the last time that she saw Terry was on November 5th of 1993 outside of the Mason City Country Club. The police later found the car, but no signs of Terry. Nobody would find Terry for many years to come. Alright, so fortunately, and well, unfortunately for the victims, that is the end of their murder spree. The 2 men that he worked closely with, plus 3 other innocent victims of circumstance, were dead, and there was no case against Dustin, and very little evidence to go on. So one might think to themselves that you should probably keep your fucking nose clean at this point, keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, and you just might get out of this entire ordeal alive. But let's also just say that this dude was moderately book smart, but common sense wise, he was a complete fucking idiot. Now, I don't get very many chances to do this, but I would like to apologize to somebody I had mentioned in the first part of the Dustin Honken series. I accidentally said the name Christy Gobats, but her name is Christy Gaubats. So I want to apologize to Christy, actually, you know what? Fuck it, here it goes.
Well, my name is Christy Galbatz, and my relation to this case is I was Angela Johnson's best friend at the time and her confidant, which ended up being her downfall, but that's who I am.
So yeah, that's Christy Galbatz. You heard me talk about her in the first episode. And I managed to get a hold of her due to the fact that she is my friend's mother. I knew that she was kind of involved in the case, did a little bit of research, and I kind of tracked it back to my friend, and this is something that I had never known about. But I did manage to get Christy on the mic, and I have to apologize if the audio is a little off. It's due to the fact that not everybody has a recording set up, and I recorded as much as I could with her. But I was more curious about what she meant by Angela's downfall.
When she told me everything that her and Dustin did to these 5 people, I of course told her we can't be friends anymore. And she let me know that if I told anyone and Dustin found out, that he would kill my daughters and then kill myself, and I had better keep the secret. So I loved my family, and I kept that secret for 7 years.
Can you imagine that? Somebody that told you a secret that you murdered 5 people. And then they say that if you tell anybody, if you want justice for these victims, then we are going to kill you and your entire family, like we did with Lori Duncan. Any kind of person would want to protect their family at all costs. And if you're talking to people who just murdered 5 people, you know they're unhinged, and they probably will do the same to you, no matter what. So because of this, I asked Christy what her gut reaction was when Angela had first told her about these 5 murders.
My reaction was utter shock that I could have been friends with someone that was capable of doing something like that or being a party to it. But yeah, it was quite shocking.
So as most families are, you have some kids, the house is probably a mess. You do some cleaning, you care about your family, you don't want them living in filth. And I'm not saying that she was, but Christy found herself something that she never thought that she ever would.
I found the murder weapon in my kids' closet.
That's right. She was the one who found the Tech-9 with a silencer on it. I was speechless when she told me this, but let me let her tell you a little bit more.
I found that in an upstairs bedroom that belonged to one of my daughters. I found it in the closet.
See, and I can't even imagine what that feels like.
Even years later, words can't describe my utter horror at finding that. And I called her up and screamed at her that there was this still in the makeup bag that she used, and I wanted it out of my house, and she assured me that Dustin would take care of it. She was very sorry, and said he would take care of it as soon as possible, and he did. He came over within minutes and just took it out, and we didn't say a word to each other.
So Dustin came over, grabbed the gun, then proceeded to contact his friend Timothy Cutcomp for some assistance. They had used a torch to cut the gun into multiple pieces to make sure that all information or distinguishing features were unrecognizable, then proceed to drive around some country roads in the area and start tossing out random pieces into the ditch, finally getting rid of all the evidence. Now pretty much all of the evidence is finally gone. The bodies haven't even been located, and it seems like everything is set in motion to stay out from behind bars. But again, let's just say that Dustin is kind of street dumb. So let's just remember that. With the victims nowhere to be found, the gun destroyed, Dustin also had problems with keeping his mouth shut. According to Timothy Cutcomp, that was later taken from testimony of his trial, as Tim had put it, Dustin had presented him with somewhat of a fake scenario in which he talked about Timothy and maybe some close friends would be taken hostage while Tim was made to make a videotape exonerating a different person. Now, would Tim comply with that? When Tim said no, Dustin had described to him that now he and his friends would be killed, whether Tim made the tape or not. Now later in the winter of 93 to 94, when they were cutting the gun into pieces, Dustin had brought with him a VHS tape in which he said Greg Nicholson had made the tape himself and admitted that Dustin had nothing to do with the drug enterprise that he was running and completely exonerated him of all charges and ended with an apology to the police for turning Dustin in. Dustin stated that Greg brought it to him just before he skipped town. Tim had stated that he had never watched the videotape. That's something that you really would never forget about, if you ask me. It really says something about Dustin, though. He has this hypothetical question for Tim asking if he'd make a tape to try to remove charges from someone or else his friends and family would be killed, but that's just kind of a what would you do kind of thing. But then he has the fucking audacity to show up to work with Tim and brings along a goddamn videotape describing that Greg had made this tape for him, and he hasn't been seen for months? Are you kidding me? So, how about another hypothetical question for Tim on behalf of our old friend Dustin? Later, Tim had said in testimony that in the spring of 1994, Dustin had told him that the other associate, Terry DeGuess, had been subpoenaed by a grand jury for the drug charges after they couldn't find Greg Nicholson. He stated that Dustin was upset that if Terry eventually charged him with any crimes, he would flip on Dustin and turn him in. The conversation went on later to discuss how deep farm equipment could break through the Earth's surface when they had to plow for planting crops. Now, Tim had later stated that Dustin was concerned more about this than anybody rightfully should, and Tim took that as Terry's body not being buried deep enough. Dustin had later asked him how deep you would have to bury something to properly ensure that the frost would not bring it up to the Earth's surface, and then he told Tim that he intended on purchasing a backhoe to go and get rid of some loose ends. But it didn't stop there, though. When he was wondering about the backhoe, he had asked Tim how to build a homemade incinerator and specifically how hot it would have to be to fully dispose of and burn a body. Now this sparked the curiosity of Tim, and he asked Dustin what were the chances that either Greg or Terry would show up again. And Dustin had looked at him and said, quote, "I'm 99% sure that Greg will never show up again, but I'm less % sure of Terry." So obviously, Dustin is giving out too much information regarding the cases, the bodies, and honestly, he's being a chatterbox, in which he is in no shape to be talking to anybody about this, considering that, he murdered 5 people, and as far as Tim thought, just 2 was enough. But, as I stated before, keeping your nose clean doesn't seem like the highest priority to him. So Tim and Dustin kept making meth the entire time. You've got a pending drug case against you, and although you eliminated the witnesses against you, you're a complete dumbass and still go out and make meth. I know I brought it up back in part 1 of this series, but it's kind of like Walter White from Breaking Bad. This dude even had a job at the time working at the Kraft food factory in Mason City, but apparently it wasn't paying enough of the bills, so he still had to make meth on the side. Funny enough, in the past week, a classmate of mine from back in my hometown had reached out to me and told me that this case hits a little bit close to home, considering that their parents worked with Dustin at the Kraft food factory, and he would ask them repeatedly if they would like to go out for drinks. Lucky for them, There was just kind of that something that would rub them the wrong way, and they denied every request that he had. So, if you don't mind, I would like to give a big shout out to my friend Kai back home, and as always, thank you for listening. But anyways, getting back to it, more time passes, more meth is made, more stupidity is afoot, and the police are still trying to locate these 5 missing people. They had discovered that it was definitely out of the ordinary for Lori Duncan's house to be left in such an undisturbed state. The police found a note at the neighbor's house that stated, quote, "Phyllis had to leave on short notice. We'll be in touch shortly. Love, Lori." Now, the police also searched any airlines, hotels in the area, taxis, and rental car agencies, and found that there was no information from either Greg or Lori, and Lori was even found to have roughly $600 in her bank account, but there hadn't been any activity in her account except for a deposit from the state of Iowa. Investigators had also checked with all 50 states to try to locate Lori or her daughters using their names, Lori's maiden name, birth dates, social security numbers, and they found no records whatsoever. Not even school districts had reported that the girls had been enrolled. The police were at a total loss, and they had little to no evidence that supported the theory that Greg, Lori were even still alive at this point. So as time goes on, Dustin keeps making meth with Tim and starts looking for other recruits to get him involved in his manufacturing and distribution process. Now, this was no easy task, as the 2 men he worked with either ended up murdered because one of them ratted out, or the other one was just a loose end that he wanted to clean up. So he started looking into his coworkers at Kraft Foods in Mason City. He needed someone that he could trust more than anyone. He and Tim had started discussing people that they could trust. Dustin had compiled a list of people who were, quote, good or, quote, possible rats, based off of him working closely with them at the factory. Now this goes on for a while, but Tim and Dustin keep making meth and keeping one eye over their shoulders the entire time. In early 1994, Dustin and Angela had become parents to a boy, and after that, Dustin and Angela have another child, but this time was a little girl. Now that brings us to 1995. Even after countless efforts of trying to find any of the 5 people, and every single outlet that they had tried had left them empty-handed, in March of 1995, with no testimony from the witnesses, the federal drug charges were dropped against Dustin, and he was a free man. So he does what every guy would do in this situation. He packed up his shit and he moved to Mason City, got a house, and started making meth in his very own home. You know, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now, considering that he thought he couldn't be charged with some stupid form of double jeopardy, he started making more and more meth, then had finally decided on a person who he thought would be good for this drug manufacturing process. So in early to mid-1995, he approached a co-worker at the Kraft factory by the name of Daniel Cobean, and he had promised him everything under the blue sky if he started making meth with he and Timothy Cutcomp. Now, it's not every day that a coworker asks you if you want to start making and selling meth, so Dan did what was the smartest thing to do at the time, and he swiftly reported Dustin's ass to the cops, telling them what Dustin had told him. Now, remembering that the case was dropped against Dustin, the police were looking for pretty much anything to get their hands on and try to pin Dustin back to the wall. So they convinced Daniel to cooperate with the police and work as an undercover informant to them, to relay any and all information back to them regarding the making and selling of the meth, and more importantly, if he heard anything about the people missing from years prior. At that point, he went back to Dustin and had agreed to cook with him, but Dustin wanted him to cook meth at his own residence instead of working exclusively at Dustin's house. He said that the traffic would probably be noticeable and would probably try to raise some red flags to the police. So, doing what the police had told him, he cooperated with Dustin and then was given money from Tim and Angela and headed off with Dustin and Tim to get some new fancy meth lab equipment for his own home. Now, the investigation had lasted over 6 months, and when they were given all the info that they needed, nothing was ever brought up about the 5 murders that took place in 1993. However, on February 7th of 1996, the police department executed a search warrant to Dustin's house and found his shitty little meth lab, as well as paper notes and books on the processes to manufacture meth and other drugs, and other information on how to bind and gag prisoners. They had also found that he was missing a hydrogen tank that was reported to be on the property. Before they executed the warrant, though, Dustin had talked to another coworker and asked him if he would keep the hydrogen tank at his place, but later on, the police had found the tank at his coworker's house and added that to the evidence. Now that day, both Timothy Cutcomp and Dustin Lee Honken were charged with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine from all the way back in 1992 until February 7th of 1993. They finally got this fucker and enough evidence to keep him locked up. Not only that, but since they also charged him, it would make it a lot harder to try and take care of him, considering the cops were already looking at him as a person of interest in the 1993 disappearances. Now let's just say that Dustin was less pleased about this, thinking that you'll get away with murder and then get nabbed for a second time with drug charges. So he started talking with Tim about how they were going to beat the system. But let's just say that while they were out awaiting trial, the court had mandated that Dustin had to wear an ankle monitor so he would be able to be located at all times, but this would be the least of his issues, as Tim would later throw Dustin under the bus. Now, I hate to say it, but you've got to take Tim's side on all of this. He's now going to court to go down with a vicious psychopath who talks about digging up ground with a backhoe, then making a homemade incinerator to try and destroy a body, then hypothetically not only asks you if you would make an exoneration tape, but actually brings an exoneration tape of one of the missing people to your front door? Excuse me, but I'd toss Betty White under the bus if she was talking to me about some crazy shit like that. Without a single doubt in my mind, I would be shitting bricks to try and keep this guy away from me. So Tim started thinking of some ways to get rid of Dustin. He met up with him quite a few times, and Dustin was still going on about how he wanted to avoid the new drug charges, because if he can get away with it once before, what's not to stop him from doing it a second time? When he was meeting with Tim, he discussed with him how he thought that all the evidence against them was kept in a storage unit in Bondurant, Iowa, which was about 120 miles south of Mason City and not far from Iowa's capital of Des Moines. He discussed how getting rid of the meth lab evidence would definitely put a hinder in the prosecution's case, so they headed off together to the facility and did a little bit of recon. And they discussed how they would break into the facility, destroy all the chemicals, lab equipment, and possible fingerprints off any and all pieces that could be used against them. I mean, come to think of it, they did that in Breaking Bad, so these dudes were kind of ahead of their time. But then Dustin got a lot more dark with his motives. He wanted to murder or, quote, make unavailable witnesses that were going to testify against he and Tim. This includes Daniel Cobean, who turned informant, Special Agent John Graham of the Iowa Division of Narcotics Enforcement, Special Agent David Mizell of the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA, and lab chemists who were working on the case against them. How would he take care of all these people? Well, he had talked to Tim about a murder plot, and he said that he could take off his ankle monitor, considering that would be the one thing to locate him anywhere near the people he was looking for. Dustin had also asked 3 different co-workers from Kraft to go out and purchase a handgun for him, and one person actually bought a gun for him. However, before the transaction could be finished, Tim Cutcomp had enough of Dustin's shit and went straight to the police with all of this new evidence stacked against Dustin. So before he could get his hands on the gun, Dustin was arrested for a second time and seen as a liability and sent his stupid ass to stay at the Woodbury County Jail in Sioux City, Iowa. One thing I wanted to mention that took place before this was on June 19th of 1995, 3 boys were swimming in a river that's located near the town of Fertile, and when they were swimming, they found themselves a black purse. Inside of that purse, they found Lori Duncan's driver's license, 2 library cards, and 2 rings, in which one of the rings had an engraving inside of it that was Lori Duncan's maiden name. The police were alerted and searched the area, but unfortunately found nothing pertaining to the 4 missing persons in the area. So getting back to it, Dustin is now in jail. And if you saw the artwork for the first part of the series, you can tell that even for the 90s, Dustin looked pretty fucking nerdy. And I in no way mean anything about nerds out there because I, myself, am also a nerd. But Dustin looked pretty scrawny from what I saw in pictures, and when you're in prison, you know how like some of the guys who push weights all day can usually pick on or make an example out of somebody who's not very intimidating. If you've seen Prison Break or Oz, you kind of know that they would pretty much just go for Dustin altogether. So what did Dustin do? I know I bring it up a lot, but back in episode 1, I discussed with Brittany how Casey Fredrickson had opened his mouth about doing life for child porn, but getting nothing for murder. Essentially, opening his stupid-ass mouth amongst his fellow inmates. Well, for the final time, I will say that Dustin is not very street smart. To make himself seem more intimidating and a force to be reckoned with, he started telling inmates to stay away from him because he had murdered 5 people. According to court documents, he was actually pretty successful at intimidating other witnesses. He talked about how they never found the bodies, how easy it was for him to kill them, and the fact that he still had a ton of money left over from his drug business. He gained some notoriety for all this and even made himself a couple of friends. One inmate by the name of Dean Donaldson was approached by Dustin to help him take care of a new loose end. According to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals records, it said that Dustin had confided in Donaldson and offered him a lot of money to help him get out of jail and kill Timothy Cutcomp. Now, Dustin definitely still had friends on the outside, and I can't find if he had contact with them or if the contact was recorded, but he managed to get Donaldson's girlfriend, Kathy Rick, to post Donaldson's bail and get him out. But before he got out, and trust me, this is something that will come up a few times, so please remember this, Dustin had given Donaldson a bunch of information regarding Tim that included where he might be hanging out, his work schedule, when he was most likely waking up, and even drew a map and gave him directions to Tim's house and noted where he could hide in Tim's house and then murder him. All of this information that Dustin gave him, he had Donaldson rewrite into his own notes so if they were found, they wouldn't appear in Dustin's handwriting. He then offered him a large sum of cash to help kill Tim and finally get rid of yet another witness. But not only that, he also wanted Donaldson to kill Dan Cobain's father, in which he gave him the address to his residence as well. Now, this definitely seems like a reoccurring problem for Dustin, because after Dean Donaldson got himself out of jail, he went straight to the police and told them about Dustin's solicitation of murder, in which they had seized the notes written by both Dustin and Donaldson, and now they had more charges they could push against Dustin. However, Donaldson was also arrested, and this is poor judgment by the police, but they returned him back to the Woodbury jail, and apparently when Dustin saw him again, he held up his hand with his index and middle fingers pointing straight at Donaldson like a gun and called him a snitch. I still think it's kind of funny that Dustin lost all that money, but I don't think you should put an informant back behind bars with the guy he just turned into the police. That's just my personal opinion. Funny how I mentioned the show Prison Break. You know the one I'm talking about. The one where the dude gets the massive back tattoo that subtly shows the blueprints of the jail to help his brother escape. It ran for a bunch of seasons in the mid to late 2000s, then was continued in 2017, and that didn't garner much attention. I personally like the show, but not very many people know about the show Prison Break, Iowa edition. Yes, that's right. That's a shitty joke. And I'm not sorry for it. So when Dustin was still awaiting trial and then handed down a conspiracy charge for trying to have Tim Cutcomb killed, he started devising a plan to get himself out of jail and take care of Tim himself. He recruited another inmate by the name of Dennis Putzier to help assist with the escape, help kill Tim, and in return, he stated that he would take care of Dennis forever, providing money and other provisions. So then they started to break through the wall in a cell. So while in Dustin's cell, he and Putzier managed to get a good section of the way through the wall until they found themselves stuck by a reinforcement bar that was secured in the wall to thwart any stupid antics such as theirs. So Dustin had found himself some sort of an abrasive object taken from a staircase, and he gave it to Putzier to try and make some headway on the reinforcement. In the meantime, he had told him that Angela Johnson, who was still on the outside, was planning to bring a hacksaw, some rope, and other assorted tools to help them escape from the Woodbury jail. So Putzier started hacking away at the reinforcement bar, but again, Dustin was an idiot and could have possibly gotten away with it if he had just learned to keep his fucking mouth shut. So the other inmates heard about the plot to escape and did the smart thing and told the corrections officers, who found the hole in the wall and then, swiftly, reprimanded Dustin and Putzier. Have you ever heard the term, "there's no honor amongst thieves"? Essentially, it means that even when you're dumb enough to tell others what you've done and try to confide in them, it's criminals acting amongst criminals, so the trusted are few and far between. It's really telling how naive Dustin is in all of this. Tim ratted him out, Greg ratted him out, Donaldson ratted him out, and the other inmates foiled their escape plan. How dumb do you have to be to think that since you murdered 2 children and 3 others, that people are really going to want to take your nerdy ass too seriously? I'd flip on him in a second if given the chance. So another person that he tried to recruit was a cellmate by the name of Dana Rasmussen, and he testified that Dustin wanted him to kill a, quote, childhood friend. But when Dana had refused, he concocted a plan to just do a drive-by and shoot up his friend's house to scare the shit out of him. Remember what I said earlier to pay attention to? Maps. He drew a map to the friend's house and times that they might be there so they could carry out his instructions and be paid handsomely in return. He had Dana copy the information as well, as it wouldn't have Dustin's handwriting on it. Obviously, Dana flipped on him as well, and Dustin was unilaterally fucked altogether. You see, Angela had a plan of her own to keep herself afloat while Dustin was in jail. She had kept in contact with him, and he gave her information on how to make and distribute methamphetamine. However, she wasn't the master chemist, and she started getting all of the supplies from one location, and on June 11th of 1996, the authorities seized chemicals and equipment from a storage shed that was on Angela's property. So, what happens next? Considering that Dustin was turned in for the attempted murders, the conspiracy of murders, escaped attempts, and the federal drug charges, Dustin was looking at a lot of time in jail and possibly the rest of his life. That brings us to his trial and subsequent sentencing. On June 2nd of 1997, Dustin pled guilty to the federal drug charges, but pled not guilty to any obstruction of justice, including the disappearances of Greg, the Duncan family, and Terry. He also denied having anything to do with destroying the gun with Tim, planning to kill Dan Cobain, posting bail for Dean Donaldson in return for him killing Tim, trying to escape from jail, and hiding the hydrogen tank at a coworker's house to prevent the police from finding it. So, just the drug charges, since he and Tim were unsuccessful at destroying the evidence that was seized by the DEA and DCI. Now, one thing I haven't seen very often is what's called a, quote, extraordinary case. Since the gravity of the charges against Dustin were more than just federal drug crimes, he was sentenced to 324 months or 27 years in prison for the charges later in December of 1997. So that's one thing that the police finally got against him, although it took them several years to finally pin him down. And at sentencing, Angela had yelled that, quote, "If Dustin wasn't going to be able to see his kids, I'm going to make sure that Jeff isn't going to be able to see his either." Jeff is Jeff Honken, which is Dustin's brother, and Angela just threatened the murder of his children. So she's kind of going ballistic at this time. Meanwhile, the police kept looking anywhere they could for the missing 5 people that he and Angela killed 4 years prior. The DCI got themselves a tidbit of information and were able to excavate a property in Hancock County looking for any of the bodies, but their efforts were found to be unsuccessful. But they are still working diligently on building a case against someone else. So they had decided to place Dustin in the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, which is a supermax security prison, so he's got to do what he can to get by. So he starts opening his mouth again and starts flexing on fellow inmates about how he killed 5 people, including 2 children. In 1998, he started talking to a fellow inmate by the name of Fred Tokars, who is currently serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. He told Fred about how he, quote, "killed my rats." And then when Fred asked why he killed the girls, he said, quote, "they were rats being raised by rats." He also confessed to him not only that he killed Greg, Lori, and her daughters as well as Terry, but he made the mistake of giving him great detail about how he used Angela to get into Lori's house, and how she was the one who talked Terry into meeting up, which eventually led to his death. Now, Fred Tokars killed his wife, and that's undeniable. But he went to the authorities with this information considering the bodies had not been found. This only caused the authorities to add it to the case against Angela and possible information against Dustin, but not in the way that you would think. In July of 2000, the DCI and police went to Angela's house and arrested her for murder and took her to the Benton County Jail in Iowa. Going back to what she said to Dustin's brother, you can tell that she's pretty much out for blood at any costs. Considering she was now in jail because, once again, Dustin couldn't keep his mouth shut, she wanted to do anything and everything possible to either avoid the charges at hand or completely throw Dustin to the wolves. While she was in prison, she befriended a fellow inmate by the name of Robert McNeese. She had told him about what Dustin had done to her and why she was in jail. She told him about the missing persons, and McNeese had managed to use a little bit of the old razzle-dazzle to get Angela to confess even more. Now just remember, there is no honor amongst thieves. McNeese had Angela finally convinced that he was part of a mob and would be able to convince an inmate serving a life sentence to take the fall for the murders and eventually get Angela and possibly Dustin out of jail. So they congregated a bunch of times, and he was writing down the information, meanwhile trying to avoid suspicion by the corrections officers. She gave him details about when, how, and where the 5 people were murdered, and once again, she used maps. He had her draw out some maps to the shallow grave of Greg, Lori, Candace, and Amber, then a separate map that showed the area where Terry DeGuess was buried out behind an old abandoned house on some farmland. He was as thorough and as diligent as he possibly could be because he knew of the case, and while there is no honor amongst thieves, sometimes the honesty or better intentions of an inmate can really shine through. It took a few months for him to persuade Angela to confide in him, and even more time to build up his information, but while both Angela and Dustin were behind bars, and Christy Galbaz had finally felt safe enough to come forward to the DCI, FBI, and DEA about what Angela had told her 7 years prior. I asked Christy what finally made her come forward with the information to the police, and this is what she had told me.
After 7 years, I was having nightmares, and I was hearing on the news that Lori Duncan's family was still searching, and it really, really bothered me to my core. And I had nightmares where I would see my father, who had died years ago, and it was a very vivid nightmare. He was holding the hands of these two little girls, and he was saying something to me, and I couldn't hear him, and I would just wake up and sweat, and it was awful. And that went on for a month or so, and I knew I had to take a chance and say what I knew. I had to do it.
So I also asked Christy if she kept the secret in fear of Dustin and Angela coming after her, and this is what she had to say.
If I would have known that me and my family were going to get the protection that we did from these agencies that were involved, I probably would have come forward sooner. But these guys, the DCI, FBI, DEA, they all immediately watched over my family and I. They would follow my girls to school. They would follow me to work, to the grocery store. They were on it. As a matter of fact, one agent told me, we're not going to lose another witness. So they went all out to protect us.
So now we have a trusted friend who, at the cost of losing her own life plus her two daughters' lives, finally feels safe enough to come forward with everything that she knew. And listening to that dream, I can't even fathom what that must have felt like for her. Just imagine that. 7 years of mental torture and fear finally lifted off of her shoulders, and with her testimony, she could very well hold the keys to their jail cells. So in early October of 2000, McNeese comes forward to the police with all the information that Angela had given to him after she couldn't keep her mouth shut, and he turned it into the police, which also included the maps and the corroboration of how and when the murders took place. When he turned it into the officers, they immediately contacted the FBI, DCI, and DEA, and on October 13th of 2000, the federal authorities converged on a wooded area just off of County Road S34 west of Mason City and unearthed the remains of Greg Nicholson and Lori Duncan, who were bound and gagged, along with the bodies of Candace and Amber Duncan, all laying in the same shallow grave that they had been in for the past 7 years. They finally found them. They alerted the family that the bodies of their loved ones had finally been found, and they would continue to investigate for the time being and help build the murder cases that they were considering since they finally had the bodies. Later on November 8th of 2000, the authorities had finally located the remains of Terry DeGuess in a farm field in Birchnell, making more sense of why Dustin kept asking Tim about how deep farm equipment would dig, as he didn't want Terry to be found. Well, apparently it doesn't dig deep enough, and it took them 7 years and 3 days from the date that he was murdered to finally find him and give his family some closure. He was found to have multiple fractures in his skull from the baseball bat, and the coroner said that all 5 victims that were found have died from multiple gunshot wounds to the head. These discoveries, plus the testimony from Christy Galbots, had finally helped the investigators, DCI, FBI, and DEA build the cases against both Angela and Dustin. One could only think that if they had both kept their mouths shut, they would have gotten away with murder. Luckily for the families of the victims, the people who were almost killed, for the police who worked tirelessly on this case, and for Christy, who had this haunting secret for so many years, they fired off their mouths and led to their own downfall. Though, while Dustin was locked up at the federal prison in Florence, Colorado, he was still devising plans on how to break out of the Supermax jail, considering he had a sneaking suspicion that he was about to go down for murder charges. If he was tried for the murders, he planned to call his associates as witnesses in the jail in Sioux City, then kill the guards and escape the prison. After getting away, he planned to murder all witnesses against him, including police and federal prosecutors. Now, I love my state, but some people just kinda... This is some definite Iowa shit. To prepare for the escape, Dustin and fellow inmates started practicing the ability to steal an officer's handgun, then learn how to pick locks with minimal tools and effort, and even went as far as to start practicing martial arts moves and scenarios centering around them having encounters with police officers. Not only is this dude a total fucking nerd, but he starts doing his own karate moves to somehow thwart the police. He definitely spent way too much in Iowa. So getting back to it, in July and August of 2001, indictments regarding Angela and Dustin are officially issued, with Dustin being charged with the murders of all 5 victims, then Angela being charged with 4 counts of murder, including Greg, Lori, Candace, and Amber. Considering these were federal charges, they were both eligible for the death penalty. Except one shitty thing happens before their trial. On April 24th of 2002, the U.S. District Judge Mark Bennett ruled that any of the papers or evidence that was obtained by Robert McNeese was deemed to be inadmissible and couldn't be used against Angela in her trial. So that really puts a hinder in the prosecution's case against them. But even though it's inadmissible, his notes that he got from Angela still led the investigators to the bodies and then give the family some sense of closure. While in prison, both are charged with the crimes. Dustin is first stated to have pled innocent to the murder charges on October 9th of 2002, less than 2 years after the bodies were found. Angela also decides to plead not guilty. Their defense teams have a lot of work to do to try to find them not guilty. Considering notes couldn't be used against Angela, it was going to be a lot harder to prove it for her. But one small thing. Out of all the people they have tried to murder while in prison, they unfortunately forgot about Christy, who turned out to be the key witness for the prosecutors in this case. After multiple interviews with the authorities, the prosecution felt they had enough evidence from Christy and Tim and proceed with their trial dates. Dustin's trial had begun on September of 2004 in Sioux City, Iowa, the same prison in which he spilled his beans and attempted to escape from. The tension in the air was so thick that you could almost cut it with a knife. Christy took the stand and told the jury exactly what they needed to hear based on how she found the murder weapon, the murders that Angela had told her about, and let's just say that it was a pretty intense place to be at the time. After Christy's testimony and loads of evidence stacked against Dustin, the trial went on into October. After deliberation, they had found Dustin guilty of all charges related to the murder, and on 1 year later, Dustin Lee Honken was sentenced to death for the murders of 5 people. Now, Angela's trial began in May of 2005, also in Sioux City, Iowa, after an unsuccessful change of venue, as both her and Dustin's were very newsworthy cases at the time. Her trial began, and Christy also testified at her trial, staring down into the eyes of one of her oldest friends, who had now grown into a complete and utter monster, capable of carrying out such an evil plan. One thing that Christy told me after we were finished with the interview was something else that she had discovered, and I didn't get her on record saying it, but this is what she had told me. Here's a story for you. When my daughter was 4, her sperm donor had her for 3 months in California and wasn't going to bring her to me, and I couldn't afford to go there. So, my bestie Angela said, "Hey, me and Dustin have some business in Arizona to do, so we'll meet up with him and we can bring her back." "That's fantastic," she said. Of course, after his trial, I found the pictures I had of the 3 of them: Angie, Dustin and my 4-year-old daughter out in the desert, nothing but sand and cacti. My daughter is on top of his shoulders and she's holding her hands. Everyone is smiling. When I saw those pictures again, I swear to you, I projectile vomited right where I sat. Now, I can't tell you whether or not it was before or after the murders, but I do know that her daughter was born in 1989. And if she was 4, that would have meant that this picture itself was taken in 1993. These people that she trusted with her own daughter, and trust me, I know how long it takes to get to Arizona from Iowa, and it is not a quick trip. But they brought her back, and she was none the wiser to who or what they were capable of. Now, getting back to the trial, here is how Christy described the setting of the courtroom.
Well, it was very unnerving, to say the least. They were, at each of their trials, they were both chained to the floor, chained to the desk, and there was a sheriff standing next to them throughout with a shotgun at the ready.
Angela's trial didn't even take a month, and thanks to the evidence that they had and the testimony that Christy had against Angela, when everything was said and done, she was convicted on 4 counts of murder at the end of May of 2005. Now, Dustin's sentencing took place later in October of 2005, and due to the nature of his crimes, he was handed down the death penalty and sent to the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. Of course, when you get the death sentence, there's pretty much an automatic appeal put in place, but in September of 2008, Dustin Honken's appeal was denied and his sentencing was upheld. I asked Christy how she personally feels about the death penalty, and here is what she said.
Oh, I'm all for it.
So I also asked her, considering how close this was, that if Dustin deserved to be executed, and this is what she told me.
Yes, he deserves to die. I only wish it could be more painful than just go to sleep.
So I honestly can't say that I blame her or her feelings, since this was literally not only at her front door, but in her daughter's closet. Now, Angela's sentencing was scheduled for December of 2005. She was handed down 4 death sentences for her involvement with the case, which is somewhat noteworthy due to the fact that she was the first woman to be sent to federal death row in Iowa in over 50 years. She also appealed her sentence, but that was denied in November of 2008, and they upheld the sentencing for death. Now, I asked Christy if she thinks that Angela acted out of fear of Dustin, and that's why she helped him with the murders and the secrets that they held so close. Here's what she had to say.
No, it was definitely not fear.
I also asked Christy if Angela deserved to be executed.
Yes, and she was.
The reason why Christy said she was because on March 22nd of 2012, the U.S. District Court Judge Mark Bennett threw out Angela's execution sentence. The reason he cited was a failure to introduce evidence about Angela's mental state from a, quote, alarmingly dysfunctional team, in which she was sentenced to life behind bars. Now, Christy also told me something that happened with the investigator that she was in contact with. I'm kind of warning you right now, this is very frightening.
After both trials were over, this agent from the DCI called me up and asked me to meet him because he had something to show me. And it turned out she had drawn a map of my house. The inside, she had written on there when my kids got home from school, what time I'd get home from work, details of where the bedrooms were located. turns out she was trying to complete a transaction while she was in jail and have someone come in and murder me and my family. No, I was shocked when he slid it across the table, and I said, that's my house. And he said, yep, it sure is. That was a little unnerving. She was going to get some payback on me.
Even after Angela was convicted, she still had a plan to draw out some maps and have people taken care of. Thankfully for Christy, she had the protection that she needed, and her family were safe. Now, Christy did tell me that she had a little bit of an update regarding Angela.
Angela Johnson is now literally 90 minutes away from me and all the victims' families. She was transferred from a maximum federal prison in Texas to a minimum security prison in Waseca, Minnesota. And actually, the head agent of the DCI at that time, he's the one that called me and alerted me to this. And it was, yes, very unnerving to hear she was that close.
The woman who threatened to kill her and her entire family, who had also killed 5 people before, was transferred to a jail 90 minutes away from her without her knowledge beforehand. That's the kind of stuff that gives you the heebie-jeebies. As I mentioned in part 1 of this series, the last execution from the state took place in 2003, and the death penalty was taken off the table altogether. So that brings us up to 2019. Angela and Dustin are both behind bars for their crimes. Angela has now been given a life sentence behind bars with no possibility of parole, and it was announced that Dustin Lee Honken is to be executed, finally bringing an end to his monstrous life. Now, I asked Christy whether or not she thinks the victims' families will consider this justice, and this is what she had to say.
I don't know. I can't answer that right now. I'm happy for them, but I hope it is their closure, at least for one aspect.
When I first spoke with Christy's daughter, she told me that her mother had been contacted by an investigator, and she was invited to watch the execution. So I asked Christy if she was going to attend.
If I can, yes. Yes. It wasn't set in stone, but they're trying to make arrangements.
After they extended the invitation to Christy to watch this once friend turned incredible monster be killed by the government, she had someone knocking at her door who wanted to have a word with her.
Well, first of all, I couldn't imagine why she would have been here from Pennsylvania, and she wanted to ask me questions about the case and Dustin, and I just couldn't imagine, since he was being sentenced to die, what she could possibly gain. And she asked me a few questions, and at the end of it, I said, what do you hope to gain by all this? And she was an advocate for the state not going through with his execution.
Now, I'm not going to sit here and preach to you about my side of the death penalty. There are many listeners in countries that have the death penalty or they don't have it. But in my honest-to-God opinion, I also think that Dustin should be executed, not only because he murdered 5 people, but the fact that he murdered 2 young girls is especially heinous to me. Granted, I also feel the same way as Christy, where I wish it wasn't pentobarbital that put him down, and maybe a baseball bat, just like he did to Terry DeGuess. But that is 100% my opinion. I asked Christy if she felt like him being executed was going to give her some closure.
Not 100%, no. And especially since there's there's always something about these two that come up in the news. And a few days ago, actually, there's more. And Dustin is now saying he has information on some cold case Iowa murders that he can give information on, apparently. And he wants to exchange that information for his stay of execution.
Do you think he's just feeding them a line of shit, though?
I don't know. But my gut tells me right now that he's not going to get executed. So I'm really not holding my breath on that.
The last thing that I asked Christy during the interview was that if she still thinks about this case. I'm at a loss.
You asked if I think about the case. Yeah, I think about this a lot. And it's been 25 years.
As it stands right now, there are 4 inmates who are going to be executed between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. Dustin Lee Honken will be the 5th person to be executed on January 15th of 2020 for the litany of crimes that he committed. I'm hoping, personally, for the closure of the families and Christy that his cold case claims are actually valid, hopefully bringing some information to who might have killed Jody Huisentruit or some other unsolved murders in Iowa. But a part of me still hopes that we can finally rid the world of this vicious monster. Now, I would like to give a special thank you to Christy Galbots for letting me interview her and the information that she had given me. I will be heading back to Iowa soon, and I will be looking at the information that she said she still has stored safely. Another side note is that the Dustin Honken case was the first episode that I did since the Dayton shooting, and part 1 was in September, as well as this part you're listening to being part 2. And I offered something to Christy. I will be donating all of the ad revenue for the month of September to a charity of Christy's choice. But if you would like to help out, please share this series with a friend, or even just drop a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget that if you'd like to help offset the production and research costs, you can help support the show by visiting patreon.com/murderandsuch and join the $1 tier. It's just $1 per episode and 2 episodes per month for ad-free shows, exclusive stickers, and much more. Please don't forget to follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Murder and Such. And if you would like to follow me, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, the PlayStation Network, and Snapchat at Huntor27. But I thank you for listening. I hope the countless hours I put into this show told the story the way it should have been told to you. Again, my name is Hunter, and this is Murder and Such. But until next time, I will talk to you soon. Take care.